Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity to stop the busyness of life and just think for a moment about your will and your ways. And right now we're thinking about another religious tradition that has created some division, it seems, in our world today. And we as followers of Christ, we want to understand and learn. We want to be sensitive and wise in our response. And yet at the same time, we don't want to be naive and simple-minded about complexities and threats that are out there. So Father, we just really pray that through your Spirit we would come up with the right mindset, the right words, the right perspective to understand the ever-increasing number of Muhammad followers or Allah followers following the teachings and Islam, that we would just learn to be good neighbors and listen and be good stewards of that time, and also know how to give an answer and a response for the faith that lies within us. So speaking the truth in love. And so, Father, we just ask this in the name of Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen. Okay, so we pick up this week. Last week we looked through the Prophet Muhammad and how his life unfolded, and in the context how the Quran kind of comes into being, at least according to the Islamic tradition. So this week we want to pick up from the death of Muhammad and talk about what comes next. Now, because we have such a limited time to walk through this material, we're actually going to do a bit of a whirlwind tour here and try to walk through about a millennium worth of history in 90 minutes. So buckle your seatbelts. We're going to have to move pretty quickly, all right? But here's our topics for tonight. I want to talk a little bit about where we get this information that follows with regard to the life and beliefs of Muhammad, the sayings of Muhammad, and what comes afterwards. I want to talk about the transition issues. How did we get from Muhammad to the Islamic empires that follow? And then give a few highlights, very few, about the dynasties and empires that emerged in the Islamic world, and finish up with the pieces that kind of help those empires run the territory that they conquered, the whole idea of Sharia law. Where does that come from? How does it deploy? What is that term mean? And we'll actually talk a little bit about the controversial topic of Sharia law as it applies here in America and the recent controversy over it. So that's the plan and that's the hope. So let's see what we're able to do here with this agenda. So first then we'll start with this idea of traditions, and there's two terms that we have to deal with. One has to do with hadith. What is the hadith, the traditions that come, and the sunnah, and then we'll talk about how they have been transformed into the biographies that tell the story of Muhammad. So we'll begin then with the hadith. For all Muslims, the Quran is the place where you begin. That's the Word of God as it's revealed. But as the community begins to unfold, the question came up, well, what is the example of Muhammad? What did Muhammad say about himself? It's very clear from the traditional commentaries about Islam. People want to be very clear. They're not following Muhammad, they're following Allah. And they believe Allah is God, and you follow him. So what's in the Quran is not Muhammad's teachings, it's Allah's teachings that he revealed through Muhammad. So it's a separate question in Islamic tradition. What did Muhammad teach? What were his examples? What were his exhortations? And so that's what we're talking about in terms of hadith. Primarily the prophet's words and examples, but then extended beyond that to his companions' words and examples, some of the early history. So it's just Arabic, a generic word that means the report, to report, but when you're talking about Islamic tradition, it has a very fixed idea. It's the stories and the traditions, primarily Muhammad, but also of his compatriots, how they are passed down. What did Muhammad say? What did he practice? What are the examples? Now, initially, so the Muslim scholars will tell us that it was passed down orally for the first century and a half or so, that these stories were just repeated one family to another, passed down orally, until you get to somewhere in the 8th century and the 9th century where it becomes important to write this stuff down. The assumption is that the followers of the followers are starting to die off, and so they're starting to collect these different sayings. And so there are various efforts that are put together to collect these sayings and traditions about Muhammad and his followers. Now, as soon as that starts to happen, there are internal discussions about which of these stories are reliable and which are not. And so you start to look for similarities between this story about Muhammad and that story of Muhammad. What is the line of progression? What are the earliest witnesses, and who cites those earlier witnesses? So you have a whole area of Islamic thought that deals with this transmission chain. How did you get from the first story? What are the most reliable witnesses? What are the earliest witnesses? And there's whole chains of authority and transmission that are laid out. And so based upon that, there are kind of different groups or different beliefs about the most authentic traditions. And the Sunni group, that we're going to talk today about how we get to Sunni and Shia, where they came from. But the Sunni side, they believe there are kind of 6 collections of these hadith that are somewhat reliable and you can use. Shia count for other 4. And though there are thousands and thousands of these hadith out there, but which ones can you trust? Which ones are most reliable? And the debate continues. I mean, one of the standing problems you have, remember I talked last week about the battle for the meaning of Islam and what does Islam mean. Well, one of the areas of that battle is which hadith should we regard as reliable and which aren't. And there are some very conservative, or some might say more progressive groups of Muslims that are saying, well, we don't really trust any of the hadith, just the Quran. And so you have that extreme all the way up to accepting many of these stories. So ongoing debate, which hadith should we accept as authentic? So we're reliant a lot upon the story of Muhammad, the traditions of Muhammad from these hadith. The Quran itself has signs and signals, but it's of history, but they're kind of cryptic and quick, and it's hard to develop a real story out of them. So we're heavily reliant upon the hadith for some of the stories and the actual narrative of Muhammad's life and what comes with his companions. Here's a sample hadith. I thought it might be interesting for you to see what this looks like. This is a particular hadith captured in one of the collections that is considered reliable by Muslim thinkers. This comes, and you can see the first line, it tells you who it's narrated by. In this case, it's narrated by Aisha, one of the wives of Muhammad. Also has the nickname of the mother of faithful believers. So she reports this story about a conversation that Muhammad has with this other individual, and this individual asks Muhammad, "O Allah's messenger," and that's the word for Muhammad, "O Allah's messenger, how is the divine inspiration revealed to you?" So this is the conversation, and Allah's messenger, Muhammad, replies, "Sometimes it's revealed like the ringing of a bell. This form of inspiration is the hardest of all, and this state passes off after I've grasped what is inspired. Sometimes the angel comes in the form of a man and talks to me, and I grasp whatever he says." Aisha added, "Verily I saw the prophet being inspired divinely on a very cold day and noticed the sweat dropping from his forehead as inspiration was over." And so you can see this is a tradition passed down from generation to generation to give us a little bit of the color and a little bit of the context of what happened to Muhammad when these revelations came. So that's one story. So that's a sample hadith. And you have many of these kind of illustrations of these stories and traditions passed down and grouped by who narrated them, who reported them, who reported, who's borrowing from whom, which are early, and so forth. So that just gives you a sample. Now, in addition to the hadith, we have another term that comes into play called the sunnah. And it's related to the hadith. This particular Arabic word has to do with path, habitual practice. So sometimes this word sunnah is kind of used synonymously with hadith, kind of seen as one or the other, but technically, if you really press it, it seems that the sunnah kind of is the next step. In other words, what can we extrapolate from this tradition of Muhammad, his teaching, his example, that we can actually put into practice? What are the authoritative laws and practices that emerge from the traditions about Muhammad? Obviously, the Quran forms the basis for these law and practice. But again, the Quran is mostly about spiritual experience, mostly about reflection, about God, and so forth. There's not a lot of heavy regulation about a lot of areas. So in addition to the Quran, what else could be used as authoritative when it comes to defining the practice of a Muslim community? Well, they look to this hadith and then they extrapolate from this hadith. What is that sunnah? What are the authoritative traditions and practices that can emerge from that? And what we're going to see later now, this sunnah, these traditions that are identified as authoritative kind of direction, they evolve into the fuller concept we know as Sharia law. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the text. Now, what would happen, again, in the 8th and 9th century as these hadith began to be written down, they began to be collected into biographies. And so you have several folks that began to compile actual stories of Muhammad that embed these hadith within them. They become more narrative kind of treatments. The most famous of these, and the one that gets cited most often, is this work by an individual, Ibn Ishaq. The problem with that is that we don't have the original biography. All we have is quotes and quotes of that biography that you find in other works that get embedded in it. So some scholars have tried to recreate it. In fact, Yiyam, the picture you have there on your right, is an attempt by a modern scholar to take these quotes that he finds in various texts and reconstruct what Ibn Ishaq's biography might have been. It's a very readable kind of material. Not quite biography the way you're used to hearing it, but it is readable. In fact, you can purchase it online very, very inexpensively. In fact, I found it online for free to download as a PDF, so you can see that. And again, it's a scholar's attempt to reconstruct the original text of Ibn Ishaq's biography. He's received some criticism that maybe he isn't as accurate as he thinks he is in reconstructing this, but nevertheless, it is an attempt. Shortly after Ishaq's biography, you have Ibn Hisham, who basically condensed and tries to make more to the point Ishaq's biography, to make it more readable, more accessible to the average person. So the problem is most of that has been lost as well too. So there's a couple earlier biographies were kind of dependent upon quotes. The one we do still have is the last one, Al-Tabari's biography, called Kings and Prophets, and the history of kings and prophets. And that one is a very extensive multiple volume, 39, 40 volumes that you can purchase if you're really keen on it. I think it's about $2,500, so you can go and buy the whole 40 volume set and a nice evening read there. Tabari's biography, you can go out and get samples of it. What's interesting about that is that whole transmission chain, every time he tells a story, he starts up, before he tells the story, he gives you that long transmission chain of who said it, who reported it, how many people reported it, and after he gives you the long transmission chain, then he'll give you the story. All right, so again, scholars use this. They're obviously originally Arabic editions and English translations, so that's out there as well. So you see, we've kind of evolved from the oral traditions about Muhammad and his practices to writing them down, then extrapolating from them some laws and practices that we should follow, and then gathering all that together in these biographies. So there's this effort, a serious effort within 150, 200, even 300 years from Muhammad to really make sure that as many of these traditions are preserved. Now, of course, the debate is how accurate they are, how reliable they are, and that battle will probably never be resolved. But at least you can see traditionally the belief is that these stories are preserved. So we're heavily reliant upon them for traditions about Muhammad, traditions about the history. So just wanted to make you aware of where some of those stories come from. Now, having looked a little bit at the sources, let's turn then to the content. Where did we go from, how do we get from Muhammad to Islam as an international religion? And this is a very important problem that we have to discuss because Muhammad was a prophet, right? I mean, he received the word of God or the word of Allah directly, at least that's the traditional Islamic belief. So what happens? How do you get a successor to that? I mean, Muhammad received revelation from God. I mean, doesn't God make that decision about who is the next successor by virtue of who he reveals to? But there is no further revelation. In fact, Muhammad says that before he dies, that he is the last prophet. There will be no revelations after that. And so now the Islamic community has a very difficult problem. The prophet is dead. There's no more revelation. What are we supposed to do? And so there's debates about whether Muhammad indicated who his successor should be, and there's debates about what happens. But the truth is that when he passes away, there is a debate in Medina about who should follow Muhammad. There's no more revelation coming. Muhammad said there will be no more prophets. So the community now debates what should happen. And through that discussion, two candidates kind of rise to the top as possible, not necessarily successors, because you can't have another Muhammad, but two people that could lead the community. And the two that kind of come to the forefront, one is Abu Bakr. He was the father-in-law. Now, remember, he was his cousin his friend that was one of the early followers of Muhammad, and it turns out that later Aisha, his wife, was actually Abu Bakr's daughter. So now not only is he one of Muhammad's early followers, he's also his father-in-law. And so Abu Bakr, by this time he's older, he's more seasoned, one of the first followers of Muhammad. He kind of gets put to the front as one of the candidates to be the successor. The other obvious successor is Ali, again, one of the first converts. And Ali was the son of Talib. Remember, Talib was Muhammad's uncle that was his protector, but of course never converted himself to Islam. But his son Ali, which was Muhammad's cousin, he converts very early. And so Ali is now his cousin, his family member, and by the way, his son-in-law, because he marries one of Muhammad's daughters, Fatima. So you have these two relations, one through marriage, one through blood. And they're successors. Now, the story goes, and there are multiple traditions about this, and not all Islamic traditions agree, but the basic storyline is that at the end of this, the community got together and said, look, we've got to pick a leader. Someone has got to lead this community. Who are we going to pick? And so while that meeting was going on and the discussions were meted out, eventually Abu Bakr is selected. The only problem is Ali wasn't at the meeting. He was supposedly off taking care of Muhammad's body, preparing him for burial. So debate is, why did this happen? That the other member or the other potential successor isn't even invited to the meeting. But as things unfold, Ali decides it's to his advantage and to the interest of the Islamic community if he acquiesces in all this, and he is willing to throw his support to Abu Bakr. So that is who comes after Muhammad. That is the first successor, if you will. So after Abu Bakr, we have a series of 3 more, so a total of 4 successors. And the word comes, it's called the caliphate. And it comes from this Arabic word caliph, and the idea is deputy. And it kind of has 2 sides to that meaning, caliph. One is you can't have a second Muhammad, so you can never have a prophet. You can have a deputy, someone who is deputized to take care. You're not the official leader, as it were. You're not the sheik, which was the other word. You're not the tribal boss. You're a deputy. You're a servant, which means that you're a deputy, which is the other side of the meaning. You are a deputy of Allah himself, that Allah has appointed you his deputy to be in his place. So the debate rages as to what that term really means as the head. But the idea is that this is where you get the notion of a caliphate. It's the deputized leader of this group. And the first 4 are called the rightly guided caliphate because they are kind of universally accepted as the successors to Muhammad. It's after this that you begin to get a difference of opinion, and we're going to walk through how that really happens. Now, we don't have time to walk through every single each one of these and give you a full history. It's an amazing story if you have time to read through it. Umar, the second caliph that's listed there, just an incredible story there. Sometimes it's written with an O and it's Omar. He was a big, husky guy that was just always, he was one of Muhammad's prime enemies. So the story goes that he was actually on his way to go assassinate Muhammad. But on the way, he sees his sister underneath a tree, and his sister's reading a leaf with something written on it. And he asks his sister, "What are you reading?" And his sister shows him, and it's a saying from the Quran written down in Arabic. And he reads it, and Omar is so overwhelmed by the wisdom of that he gives up his desire to kill Muhammad. And in fact, that moment is converted and goes to Muhammad and said, "I'm your follower." And so that's the story of Umar's, traditional story of Umar's conversion. But he was the warrior, he was the sword, he was the one who began to put the tough side to this Islamic expansion. Now, I should explain that when Muhammad dies, he already began, as we saw, he already began to kind of spread the control out of Medina, out of Mecca, to surrounding areas in the Arabic Peninsula. Well, when Abu Bakr comes to power, he has a very difficult problem early on because he has to suppress rebellions all over the place. Many of the tribes that Muhammad had suppressed and took over as part of the expansion of his Muslim community, when Muhammad died, there were rebellions all over the place. And so Abu Bakr's, most of his caliphate was taken up with bringing everybody back online, holding and maintaining the gains that Muhammad had made and expanding them beyond that, of course, but within that Arabic Peninsula, just holding on to that becomes the primary preoccupation of his caliphate. But with Umar, you began to expand north and west as well as north and east. And so he begins to press the empire further and further around. Now, if you know the history of this area, there are 2 great empires that border on the north of Arabia. One is the Byzantine Christian Empire that was more to the west, north and west area. They held vast swaths, and of course Europe and Northern Africa and that side of things. They were directly to the north and west of Arabia. On the north and east, you have the Sassanid Empire, which was the old Persian Empire. And so when Umar comes to power, he begins to push north and west and east into those two empires, into the Byzantine Christian Empire as well as into the Sassanid Persian Empire. And it's really in this moment that Islam takes on an offensive fight. The argument is that some of the passages in the Quran that talk about warfare and jihad and all those kind of things, the traditionalists will argue that those are defensive passages. They're talking about defending Islam from the attacking Meccans and surrounding areas. So that debate rages. But once the Quran is closed and you move forward, Umar really takes it to another level. He definitely recasts this image of jihad into an expansive doctrine. He believes that there is this necessity for Islam to press forward, to conquer the realm, the ungodly realm with the godly realm. And so he believes that there is an Islamic duty to press up into the Persian Empire, into the Byzantine Empire, and so that he does. And so he actually is able to bring under control and defeat, through a series of dramatic kind of stories that we don't have time to share, the whole Persian Empire, and actually bring a great deal of the Byzantine Empire in check. They move very, very quickly, and he expands the caliphate dramatically. You can kind of see the dimensions there in the map I've given. A lot of that was due to Umar's expansions. So he produced a great deal of change. Now, one of the things that come from his caliphate is his expansion into the Middle East and into what was then called Syria. And this is when you have the actual bringing of the siege of Jerusalem and taking it back from the Crusaders. So up until that point, Jerusalem was kind of owned by the Crusaders. Or no, I'm sorry, that comes much later. This is where it begins, they take it back from the Byzantines. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of my story. At this point, the Middle East was run by the Byzantine Christian Empire, and so oversaw by them. Umar's armies go in and basically put a siege to Jerusalem, and so the story goes that after the siege, they invite Umar to come in and receive the surrender of the Byzantine emperor and the Byzantine patriarch, the person in charge of the Christian church there, Sophronius. And so the story goes that Umar and his servant kind of went to Jerusalem to take possession, and the traditional story is between them they only had one donkey. And so Umar let his servant ride the donkey for a while, then Umar rode the donkey for a while, and when they got to Jerusalem, the servant was on the donkey, and everybody thought that they should give Jerusalem to the servant, until somebody had to explain that that's not the caliph. The caliph is Umar. That's, again, the traditional story. So he receives Jerusalem. So this is the interesting transition, just those of us following the history of Jerusalem and the Jewish world. This is the transition where Islam begins to take over the area of Jerusalem. And as we saw earlier when we talked about the relationship between Islam and Judaism, where this is when the Dome of the Rock begins to get constructed. This is the area where they begin to share the Holy of Holy sites with the church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Catholic Church, as well as now what would be the Wailing Wall of Judaism, all in that same area. And that's another story that's told. Again, it's just tradition, whether you believe how historical it is or not. So it's said that Sophronius invites Umar to come and pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Umar says, "No, that's your place. I'm not going to go in and desecrate your place. You just need to know that we're going to have our own place, and hopefully by virtue of you watching what we do, you will see which is the true religion." So the story goes. And so you still, to this day, have the three religious traditions sitting in that same holy site. And that is traced back to the siege of Jerusalem under Umar. After Umar, again, if you go back and look at the list, we're talking about the follower after Umar is a gentleman, is a caliph by the name of Uthman. Uthman is an interesting story in himself. Again, one of the original followers, original companions of Muhammad. He's left with the task of actually consolidating this vast empire. Umar just went out there and conquered all these lands and expanded the empire quickly. But the thing is, he did it militarily, but it's not like they had this huge population to control everything that went on. The way they conquered is they kind of conquered the town, and then they left the locals to kind of run everything, because it's not like they went in there with this huge administrative force to administrate this huge empire. It was just, it spread so rapidly and militarily, it wasn't consolidated. And so while they won military victories, they weren't really administrating everything. And so it fell to Uthman to kind of build the administrative machinery that was going to keep the empire intact. And so he starts, of course, the first thing you do when you're trying to organize things is start to collect taxes, right? We learn anything new? The first role of government is to start to institute a tax program. So that's what he does. He begins to put governors in all these places, institute this tax, enforce the whole dhimmi status that we talked about, the idea that you could practice your own religion, but as in exchange is you could pay this tax and be able to practice your faith and your religion. It's Uthman that begins to expand this throughout the whole empire. Now, what's interesting is in this expansion, one wonders, how did it happen so quickly? How were they so easily able to conquer all these surrounding lands? Why did it seem to be like hot knife through butter? Well, one of the explanations for that, and there are many, and this debate goes on, but one of the explanations is because the Byzantines were horrible governors. Nobody liked them. The Christian emperors were horrible and oppressive, and their tax rates were outrageous. And so they went into northern Africa and some of these other, same place with the Persians. There was just these horrible rulers and taxation there. So when the Muslims came in and said, hey, we have a new plan, there was receptivity there. The other reality is just before the Muslim invasions, the Byzantines and the Persians have been fighting for so many generations and so many decades that they fought this huge war just before that. They depleted each other. So both empires were really at their lowest and at their weakest, right at the time where Islam was becoming its most powerful. So if you couple in the kind of the aggressiveness of the new religion to reach out and conquer new territory, you blend that in with the weakness of the two great empires of the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire, you mix those together with a local population that's just saying, look, we're ready for a new landlord anyway, one that looks a little bit more like us and acts a little bit more like us. You end up with a cocktail that produces a really fast expansion of Islam in this early age. Now, Uthman comes to power then, and he starts to try to consolidate this into an empire through taxation and through law and through other things. The problem is that while Uthman himself, according to traditions, was very restrained morally, was wealthy in his own right, he didn't need the money, he was a rich businessman. In fact, he was one of those folks that, remember we talked about how during Muhammad's days, he sent some of the groups down to Abyssinia. He went to Abyssinia with that group and actually made new business partners. He was one of those guys that whatever he touched turned to gold. He was just an extremely wealthy person who subsidized a lot of the building campaigns and so forth in Medina. But while he himself seemed to be, at least traditionally, seemed to be this person that was very restrained in terms of his morals and his ethics, he brought in governors and relatives to be governors throughout these lands. And it turns out his relatives weren't as honest as he was. Imagine that. Shocking, right? And so what began to happen is, in order to raise taxes, those that he appointed in these various lands became more and more rigid and more severe. And so you started to get some of the realms of the empires beginning to push back and create tension. It wasn't going as smooth as everyone had hoped it would have. This promise of going out there and living this pure Islamic life and bringing everybody to the light and becoming a part, that wasn't working, all right? And so there, you began to have these tensions in various places and various lands. And one of those areas was Egypt. Egypt began to be very upset because one of the governors that Uthman appointed, one of his relatives, became more and more oppressive. And so there is this delegation that is sent from Egypt to Uthman, who's now, I think, pushing 80. He's getting up there in years. This delegation comes to Egypt, and they are trying to get him to relax get his governor to relax some of this taxation problems. And through a series of events, Uthman said, okay, I'll look at it. Why don't you head back? I'll take care of it. But on their way back, they catch one of Uthman's slaves and they find a letter on him that says that this letter that was supposed to be delivered, and this letter that was supposed to be given to the Egyptian governor saying, look, when this delegation returns, capture him and kill him. So this gets the Egyptian delegation all upset. What? So they turn around and go back to confront Uthman. And there gets to be this huge kerfluffle right there in the square. And poor Uthman goes back to just recover, read his Quran, and lo and behold, he is assassinated. So Uthman is gone now because of this Egyptian led assassination. So now we have another succession issue. Who is going to follow Uthman? Well, Ali this time has had enough. He's been twice passed over as the next caliph. And so he actually gets the support of the Egyptian delegation, and he gets himself named new caliph. However, as this is happening, Abu Bakr's daughter, the former wife of Muhammad, Aisha, opposes Ali desperately for having killed Uthman. And so she takes it upon herself to fight this tradition. And so she comes out and she actually participates on the battle. It's called the Battle of the Camel. And the traditions go that Aisha, Muhammad's wife, is now, I think, in her 40s. She's out there on a camel, participating in the battle, trying to fight this new caliph, Ali. And so it turns out that eventually his forces become victorious. He negotiates a truce with Aisha, who kind of retires now for the rest of her life and stays out of politics, goes back to Medina. And so after that struggle, there is now Ali finally is the new caliph. But Ali, it turns out, is not as able an administrator, and it turns out that it was probably a good idea that he was not the earlier caliph, but it turns out he has some problems administrating. He makes several enemies. And so his supporters turn around and assassinate him later in 1661. So he's only a caliph for like 5 years. So now there gets to be a new succession problem. Who is going to follow after Ali? And the committee comes together and they actually end up appointing a relative of Uthman called Muawiyah. And Muawiyah was one of those kind of aggressive governors that everybody had a problem. He reigns very short period of time and he dies, and now we have this real crisis problem. Who follows Muawiyah to the caliphate? And there's this huge battle that takes place, the Battle of Karbala, 680. It's between the successor of Uthman and Muawiyah. That's the way the community has selected, and the successors of Ali. So we have Yazid the first, son of Muawiyah, versus Hussein, son of Ali. There's this huge battle. Who is going to be in charge of Islam from this point forward? Well, during the battle, Hussein is killed, son of Ali. And to the Shia side, he was martyred. And this is the battle that solidifies the split between Shia and Sunni. The Sunni side are the ones that said, no, we agree that Muawiyah and Yazid I should be the next caliph. That was what the community has decided. That's the pathway. Those were the correct decisions. They should be the line of succession. That's the proper caliphate that should be passed down. Where the Shia were the supporters of Hussein and Ali, their side that said, no, this has always been, from the beginning it should have been Ali. This is the wrong line of succession. It should be determined by your relationship to Muhammad, your descent from Muhammad. That should be the proper line of descent. After all, that's the way it's always been in Arabic tradition. That's the way that Muhammad wanted it. They had traditions that they said back this up. And so that's where the split between Shia and Sunni come in. It's in this final succession war. And so going forward, you have these two separate traditions that argue about who is in charge of the Islamic empire and the Islamic dynasty. The Sunnis who see a continuation versus the Shia who see a different kind of continuation. Now, the Shia, after they lose this battle, they kind of themselves began to split into multiple groups, deciding who is the proper successor. Since you're not going to accept the successor that the community elected, which successor are you going to accept? And so the Shia began to battle and debate who is the proper successor to all of this. And eventually, over time, there's kind of three groups that kind of began to form. And the largest three, the largest I think is the Twelvers. And they believe that there are 12 imams that followed Muhammad and Ali's line, and then the imam stopped, the relationship stopped, that the last imam, when he's gone, he disappeared, and one day he will return. So that's the Twelvers, that group of Shia. There's other the Zadis, who say, yes, there are 12, but it's a different 12. And the Ismailis who say, yes, there are 7. And so those are the three main ones, but there are whole groups of Shiites that now are debating about who was the true successor, who is the right successor to Muhammad. So meanwhile, the Sunni side of it kind of continued to develop as a community, and you began to see first dynasties, and then empires began to emerge. So that's where we go next with the story, to look at the dynasties and the empires that emerged after this huge split between Sunni and Shia. Again, we don't have a lot of time to go through this story. It's a fascinating story, but there are two great dynasties that kind of emerge after this rightly guided caliphate, after Ali dies. One is the Umayyad dynasty, centered more in Damascus, Syria, Cordoba in the west, and then you have the Abbasid dynasty that emerges in the east, in Persia and Baghdad and so forth. So two great dynasties, and I put a little map for you to see exactly kind of where they, in some respects they overlap and then they're separate, but two great dynasties that emerged out of this Sunni tradition, and after the Sunni Shia split, these dynasties kind of come to power in different ways. To look at some of the highlights during this particular period between kind of the middle of the 7th century to the middle of the 13th century, I just picked a couple random events. I mean, we could be through this side of the story for a very long time, but a couple things that may be of interest to you. One is, this is the period during which Jerusalem is retaken by the Muslims. I misspoke earlier and was talking about the Crusades. I was thinking ahead of the story. This is that second part of the story. The Crusades come in the 11th century, and they retake Jerusalem from the Muslims. And they hold it since that 1099. And it's really Saladin who reorganizes under these dynasties and comes back and retakes Jerusalem in 1187. So it's really from that point forward that it becomes a Muslim territory again until after the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. So you're really talking for centuries now after this. Saladin retakes Jerusalem, and it stays in Muslim hands really up through the end of World War I. The other aspect here that's kind of interesting is this, what is called the so-called Golden Age in Cordoba, Spain. It's kind of the technical word flowering of culture, if you will, it's sometimes called. Something unusual happens in Western Europe here that was not happening anywhere else. There is this reversion or reformation of learning that happens in Cordoba, where you have philosophy, medicine, science, art. It's an emphasis on cultures of all types where even Christians and Jews and Muslims kind of work together. It's almost like a mythical tale that lasted for a short period of time. A lot of money, a lot of wealth poured into this, and it becomes kind of this place on a hill. Now, it doesn't last forever, and it's probably more idyllic. Scholars now are trying to say that's probably a little more myth than reality in some respects, but you can't deny a great deal of wealth, a great deal of learning, a great deal of cultural expansion under the Muslim control of Cordoba in Spain. That's in the west. On the east, you have Baghdad. This is the time where Baghdad becomes raised to power under the Abbasids. The Abbasid Empire really starts to make Baghdad now a flourishing culture in the east. And they create this huge library called the House of Wisdom. It's supposedly the largest library of its kind, with books and artifacts and literature and parchments assembled, all kinds of places of learning and scholarship, again, science, ocular surgery, all kinds of things being invented medically, just Arabic numbers just becoming the science of accounting and all these kind of things, just growing and emerging out of Baghdad all the way through, and really keeps going there to the middle of the 13th century when the Mughal Empire comes and destroys Baghdad and takes over. But just tremendous flowering of culture, both in the east in Baghdad and in the west in Cordoba, Spain, in various levels and in various ways, but kind of seen as the high point of Islamic culture. It's also during this period that you have the rise of Islamic mysticism, called Sufism, this dimension of Islam that looks inward. It isn't so much an outward community, it's an inward experience. We looked at, in Judaism, the Kabbalah, the mystical experience there. This is in some ways analogous to all this idea that there's a deeper truth, that the Quran has deeper truths that you can penetrate to, you can have a direct experience of Allah and so forth. You probably have culturally run into this, though you didn't know it. Some of you may have heard of the whirling dervishes, right? And you've seen the beautiful dance that they do. That comes out of the Sufi Islamic tradition. So this is where it emerges during this particular period of time. So just thought I'd introduce you to that. And I should mention, too, that some people regard Sufism as being kind of outside of Islam proper, that it's not really true Islam, they're not really true Muslims. Now, of course, the Sufis themselves would object to that classification, but there is somewhat of a debate there as to whether it fits into Islam proper, at least from an external perspective. This was also the period where you began to get some tension which we will pick up later when we get to this idea of where did the fundamentalist side, the radical side of Islam emerge from, where did it come? Well, in some ways, you can start tracing it all the way back to the medieval period. As we've seen in all the other religious traditions we've developed, once you get into the Middle Ages, you start to have, for lack of a better term, how do you deal with the new influx of culture that pushes in? The new discoveries of philosophy and science. How does religion and science and religion philosophy begin to come together? And you begin to have this movement almost of, quote, secularism, of folks going back and rediscovering the works of the Greek philosophers. How does that relate? How does this new learning relate to traditional religion? So what would later become the struggle, the face of modernism, how do you respond to modernism? We're way before modernism here. We're still in medieval period. But there was this new learning that was happening as people were re-examining the Greek and Roman classics. And so you create this tension between traditional Islamic thought and this new learning. Well, how does that cash itself out? Well, I picked two prominent scholars to show you there's two responses to that new learning. And as we see Islam develop, just as we've seen in many other religious traditions, there's two ways you can go down that path. One is the path that Al-Ghazali went down. He was a traditional Muslim scholar, but also had appreciation for mysticism and Sufi thought. But he sought to re-stimulate orthodox thinking. He was a little bit afraid that there was too much new learning creeping into Islam, with all this flowering of culture in Cordoba, all this flowering of culture in Baghdad. There was too much of this new learning that was beginning to seep in. We need to restructure and get more orthodox in our belief and teaching. And so he writes this work called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And he writes this work, and the whole point of this work is to show that the philosophers are not getting to the truth of the sublime truth of the Quran. That no matter what they do, there's a real distinction between this nonsense that's coming from philosophy and the truth of the Quran. They're not the same. They point in two different directions. So a return. And he writes his own autobiography. It's called Deliverance from Error, to show his recommitment to orthodox Islamic thought and belief. So that's one side of the response to the new learning. On the other side, you have Ibn Rushd, which we know the Latin version of his word is Averroes, and he was on the other side. He thought you could reconcile the teaching of the Quran with Aristotle, that the new learning and the Quran together, they produce a harmony. If you really apply logic and see Quran and Aristotle, they're both, all truth is God's truth. All truth is Allah's truth. He reveals it in the Quran specifically, but he also reveals it generally through these philosophers. And if you just spend the time thinking, they have correlated thought. In fact, he is so good at what he does in his commentary on Aristotle, he's used by, many of you have heard St. Thomas Aquinas, the Roman Catholic scholar. Often, St. Thomas Aquinas will refer to the commentator. And who he's talking about is this Muslim commentator on Aristotle, Averroes. So has a real impact on later thought, even in the Christian circles. And he is directly writing in opposition to Al-Ghazali. In fact, where we saw, remember we said Al-Ghazali wrote this work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. Ibn Rushd writes Incoherence of the Incoherence. He's saying, well, Al-Khawazi was incoherent in his argumentation that there's no similarity. He's not giving you solid arguments. If you really follow the solid arguments, you will see that Aristotle and Aristotle and the Quran, they speak the same truth. So two different takes on this reaction to new learning. And we're going to see that again and again. Every time culture breaks in, a new culture breaks into a religious circle, how do you respond? You either dig in your feet and get into the trenches and say, let's go back to the original sources, or you say, embrace the new learning and we'll figure it out, or you fit somewhere in between, and that's always going to be the cycle of religion all the time. So that gives us a little picture of those early dynasties, the Umayyad and the Abbasid dynasty. After these two dynasties, eventually what you have happen is the emergence of the great empires, the early modern empires that start to form. And again, this is another rich, deep story we can't even begin to touch. I just mentioned them and gave you a little map there so you can see kind of where they spread. The Ottoman Empire is probably the one you know the most and have heard of, where they are in what is now Istanbul, Turkey. They were the ones, as I say in the next slide, that oversaw the fall of Constantinople, which was that bastion of the Byzantine Empire, that eastern center of Christianity next, other than Rome. They're the ones that brought that to heel and took that over. The other dynasties here kind of oversaw the previous Persian Empire. It starts off as kind of a Shia-based empire, and then it kind of goes on from there. We have the Mughal Empire, which some people say emerges from the old Mongol Empire, Genghis Khan and all those guys, now becoming what's called the Mughal Empire, and it emerges into out of India into what we now know as Pakistan and so forth. So again, I wish we had time to go into these empires. Again, the one you probably know, the Ottoman Empire, is the one that you're most familiar with. They're the ones that oversaw this fall of Constantinople. And I think when we went over the emergence of the Jewish state, you saw that that's really where the Ottoman Empire begins to fall apart, is at the end of World War I. And when they decide to side with the Central Powers, it's after World War I where that thing gets dissembled. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have to really talk about these ancient empires. So now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about Sharia law, but it's not altogether switching gears, because you see what we've done is by walking through this history, we've seen the emergence of how do you take what is essentially a religion, a belief in Allah and the 5 pillars of Islamic practice, and how do you turn that into a community of law? What is the religious law that should be applied? Now, in the Jewish tradition, we had the Torah. We had 5 books of laws that were laid down. And you had the oral law of the Halakha. And we walked through how there's a rich tradition of law that informed the Israelite kingdom. But where does the law come from to run the Islamic kingdoms and the Islamic empires and the Islamic dynasties? Because the Quran is not in and of itself sufficient. That is, it doesn't have a lot of legalese in it. There are some guidelines in there in some directions, but it's not really a Torah. It doesn't have a list of 613 do's and don'ts. I mean, it's not in there. And so how do you emerge to a place where there's a body of law that you can actually execute? And so, as I pointed to earlier, it begins with this idea of hadith, the traditions from Muhammad, grows into sunnah. And so now we want to take that last step and say, how did that emerge into Sharia law? So, a very controversial topic in our day and age. I'll do my best to kind of hit the highlights so that at least when you're debating with your friends about the danger or lack thereof of Sharia law, you can actually base it on some sort of fact rather than opinion, right? That's what we're trying to do here. So what is Sharia? What is the meaning of the term? Well, it comes from an Arabic word that just indicates a clear, well-trodden path to water. It's just a pathway, how you get through to the clear place. And so it's really a broad definition. I gave a scholar's definition here. On the one hand, it's Islamic law, but it's not just law as you and I think of law. It's the guide, it's the path to everything on all levels. And so the definition here, the disciplines and principles that govern the behavior of a Muslim individual toward his his or herself, family, neighbors, community, city, nation, Muslim polity as a whole, the Ummah. The Ummah, by the way, is the Muslim word for community, the Ummah. It governs the interactions between communities, groups, social, economic, the criteria by which all social actions are classified, categorized, administered. In other words, it's a wide sweeping thing, Sharia. So sometimes you get the idea from reading blogs and listening to the news that Sharia law is about adultery, or it's about criminal law, it's about theft. But that's a very, very narrow definition. And sometimes when you ask Muslims, do you think we should be governed under Sharia law, you get the response that comes back. It's 50, 60, 70, 80%. And we get nervous about that. But the reality is what they're thinking when the question is asked is much different than what you're thinking when the question is asked. For them, Sharia law is this thing that governs their whole life. It governs their religion. It governs their relationships. It is, in their mind, similar, and this is controversial, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but in their minds, it's very similar to the halakha in Judaism, where it governs all these aspects of the relationship, that it covers worship as well as relationship, all kinds of things. So that's, I guess, the first caution I would give to you is just when you hear the Sharia law, don't go to this very narrow place of just these couple laws that we're talking about. In the Islamic tradition, Sharia is a very broad idea. It represents a huge swath of obligations. It's this pathway that applies to all of my life that I'm supposed to live. It is the way of life that I'm supposed to live. Now, again, taken from, and this next quote I'm taking from, again, it just points to, it's a one Islamic scholar that's trying to let us know that there's a problem. There's an internal problem within Islam itself. And I'll read the quote and then I'll try to explain what we're saying here. It says, "Now a great problem today is that a new movement within Islam, the Islamist movement," and we're going to talk 2 weeks from now on what that is, and that's this idea it's part of the radical movements of Islam, the idea to force Islam on the world. The Islamist movement has instigated a non-traditional approach to Sharia which vitiates all the past approaches and establishes a rigid, hardline, and non-programmatic approach which vitiates all semblance of humaneness, sanity, moderation, decorum, which constituted Islamic law's traditional implementation over the past 14 centuries. Now, why did I put that quote in there? What I'm trying to show you is that there's a debate within Islam itself is what is Sharia law. Again, I'm trying to caution us against putting all Muslims and all Islam in one box and saying this is what they believe or this is what they think. It's not the case. This is a quote from an Islamic scholar himself, and by the way, he's not alone. And what he's saying is there's a tradition about Sharia law that we have to figure out. And in many more progressive Islamic traditions, Sharia is developing and always develops into a modern culture. And so what he's saying is the radical side is saying, no, it doesn't develop, it doesn't grow, it doesn't flex with the times. They want to go back to a point in time and say, that's it, and you must stick to that. And so according to this Muslim scholar himself, saying, look, that's a problem. We're debating that within Islam itself. So I just thought I'd put that conflicting definition out there. Again, just to remind us, it's not one thing we're talking about. We're talking about a dynamic, Islamic, multiple tributaries, multiple dimensions, multiple movements within Islam. It's not one monolithic thing. So what does that mean? What is contained in Sharia in the vast majority of cases? Well, it has these different dimensions. Here's a quote from another organization. It talks about there's the religious ritual aspect of Sharia. The acts of worship we're going to talk about, the 5 pillars that we're going to talk about next week, including the Hajj and the prayers and so forth. The daily rules that you have to follow, the the rules about food, no pork and so forth, the abstention from alcohol, all these things, that's part of Sharia law in the average Muslim's mind. It involves private social interactions. So you're talking about marriage, divorce, inheritance, property rights, all those kind of things, civil matters, how you're supposed to govern those. And here again, your mind goes back to the Torah and all the arguments about who's married and who you're allowed to marry, who you're not allowed to marry, what happens if somebody damages your property, all those civil matters that come in. Sharia law covers all that. And then lastly, there is the public law issues. What do you do about crimes, murder, adultery, and theft, and those kind of things. So Sharia, again, has a broad swath of meanings applying to all sorts of dimensions. So how do you decide those laws? How is it figured out in Islamic tradition? Well, that's a problem. There is an argument over how to interpret and what sources can influence the development of Sharia law, and how are those sources supposed to be used. And on the right-hand side there of your screen, you can see there is, on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see kind of a list of possible sources. Now, everybody in the Islamic world, pretty much everybody, will agree that the Quran is the starting place. Like, there's no question about the Quran. That is the starting place. That is the revelation of God. That's where you begin with Sharia law. If it's in the Quran, it's there. But now remember, when we said that within the Quran itself, there's this idea of abrogation, so that later laws cancel out earlier laws. And so there's development within the Quran itself. And debate, not that anybody disagrees about the Quran being the authority, but there is a debate about what the Quran means within Islam itself. Which laws trump which other laws as one law abrogates another. After the Quran, you have the issue of hadith. Well, the Quran doesn't cover all the circumstances, no matter how you interpret it. So now we look to the traditions of Muhammad, the hadith and the sunnah that we talked about earlier. So, do you accept hadith as a legitimate source? Most Muslims would say yes. But now the debate begins. Which hadith do you accept? And what do those hadith mean? What laws do they give us about how to run a community? And then the debate continues. What happens if the hadith isn't clear? And the sunnah that comes out of the hadith isn't clear? Well, what about some other factors that can go and establish Sharia for you? Well, what about the consensus of the community? Does that have any effect, that the majority rules, or the consensus of scholars? Will that help us to decide, for example, when a legitimate marriage happens, or what it takes to prove somebody guilty of murder or adultery, whatever it might be? Does the consensus of the community, and which community? Remember, there's not a pope in Islam that decides all the rules for all the Muslims. There's no such thing. There's just different communities throughout the world, especially now that those dynasties have kind of fallen away. So who gets to decide which is the community? So does the community have a right to add to Sharia law, and if so, which community? Then let's say, for example, that isn't clear. What if there isn't a clear example of a law? Can you reason by analogy? For example, one of the standard examples are, well, the Quran or the Hadith say that slander should be punished by flogging. Well, what about drinking alcohol? What's the punishment for that? Well, so the rule by analogy says, well, alcohol causes you to slander, so therefore drinking alcohol should be flogging. So that's one kind of simplistic way of seeing how analogy works. Can you reason from a clear case to a less clear case to see what Sharia law should be? And then what about public interest? if we allow Sharia to kind of develop, what's in the best public interest for the community? Should that be a factor? And if so, what kind of factor, and how should that influence the outcome? And lastly, custom. We don't have any law, but this is the way we've already done it here. Can that be a legitimate reason for Sharia law? So I've asterisked those last four because the Muslim jurists, they debate about what extent these different sources, whether they are or are not sources of Sharia law. And if they are sources, to what extent are they sources? And what do these sources tell us about what the law should be? Add that to the complexity of all the different communities that are out there. So again, Sharia law is not one thing that we agree with or don't agree with. It has a large complexity and diversity to it that we have to be aware of when we get into these conversations. Now, on top of that, we have even more complexity when it comes to the modern version of Islam. To what extent is Sharia law actually implemented in the countries in which it is predominant? And that's kind of an arbitrary thing to kind of say, because we're not any longer in the place of empires or dynasties. That doesn't exist, except in some people's minds, which that's part of the radical problem. But most people who say we're well past the days of the Islamic dynasty or the Islamic empire. So how do you determine which are the Muslim countries and which aren't? Well, there's an organization, it's about as official as we get as far as Islamic thinking goes. It's the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It was kind of formed in the aftermath of the 6 Days War in the 60s, 67. After that, there was this idea that somehow all these international organizations, international Muslim organizations and communities have to have a voice somehow internationally, and so this voluntary organization developed. I think last I checked, there were some 57 or so nations part of this. They actually have an observer community that meets at the United Nations and the UCC. Listen, I'm a church guy. The ECC, the European community. So they're kind of as official as you get as far as an international organization, an official organization. So somebody has taken the trouble, and again, I wouldn't die on the mat that this is 1,000% accurate, but it kind of gives us the impression and the idea. Like, of all those organizations that have signed up to be a part of this, voluntarily identified themselves to be somehow connected with the Islamic movement, how do they see Sharia law in their country? And you can see there's multiple ways that it's applied. In some cases, while they identify themselves as Muslim, basically Islamic law really doesn't play any real role. That is, it's still predominantly a secular legal system, like Turkey, for example. It's a secular legal system. It really doesn't play any official role, at least as they report themselves. There are other cases where Sharia law is kind of the basis for civil matters. So if you're talking about divorce law or inheritance law or property rights, then Sharia law is applied. And then there are the smaller group that see it as criminal law and so forth. So you see Saudi Arabia and some of these other countries. Those are the stories you hear about mostly in the news, where Sharia law is the criminal law. So the harsh penalties for apostasy and for adultery and those kind of things. Those are in countries that see Sharia law as the law for criminal things as well. So not just religious, not just for civil, but criminal law as well. And then there are some other groups, particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia, where it really varies region to region. It's not like one country has one policy. It really depends where you are in that region as to how predominant Sharia law is used at that criminal level. So again, all the different levels of complexity with regard to the sources, what applies, what is a Sharia law. Add to that the complexity of whether the area you're in, to what degree Sharia law actually runs your life, to what degree is it part of the legal system. You know, for all Muslims, Sharia law is important, at least as a moral guide, much like the Ten Commandments or anything else is a moral guide to us. But to what extent now does it also the legal system in which you live, and it is the legal basis of your life. And so the countries themselves are debating. Now, on top of all this, if you want to get even more complex, as if it weren't complex enough, then you also have multiple schools of Sharia. What are all the different laws that are used? What are the different interpretations? How ought you to regard these interpretations? What are the punishments for this and that? And there are liberal schools that are more flexible and say, yeah, you got to keep up with the times, that you have to be flexible, and you have to get kind of that whole modern idea that we're going to be more lenient in some of these matters because Sharia law can change over time, versus traditionalist kind of schools that say, no, we ought to go back to the good old days where we cut people's hands off and stuff. And so there's this debate within Islam itself, multiple schools. So all to point out, be careful when you hear the word Sharia and you read the news that you just don't think it's this one thing. There's a lot of levels of complexity and diversity that go along with this, and you kind of have to ask the question, what are they talking about? Now, let's go to that controversial side. Now, most of the time when you hear Sharia law in today's conversation, it usually has something to do with the stoning of the people who commit adultery and the whippings, and you cut your hands off for robbery, and death penalty for people that apostatize. I mean, our news media seems to love those stories. So it's kind of like whenever you hear Sharia law, it equals these three crimes, which is not true, but that's what our society likes to think about. So they go to those areas of the world where this is still done. And the truth is, it is still done. And the truth is, again, for most Muslims, they see this as okay. And so what I wanted to show you here is that depending on where you are, the percentage, not all Muslims think the same way. In other words, when they went to these different countries here, this is from the Pew Research Center, they went to these different countries and they asked only Muslims in that country, do you believe, for example, that you should stone people who are committed adultery? Well, in Turkey, only 16% of the Muslims said yes. Whereas you go to Jordan, they said yes, 70%. I wonder how many Americans would think that sometimes. I guess it depends whether you're a victim of it or not, right? But you can see, again, what I'm trying to point out here is even when it comes to these very severe penalties that we hear about in the news, we should be aware it's not as if all Muslims think the same way about all this stuff. They have different opinions and different ideas depending on where they live. So I have a couple minutes left here, and I just want to kind of quickly go through the status of the American debate. And I'm not going to tell you what to think or how to decide, but I just want to make us aware that it's not as simple as we think it is when you hear these news stories. Just think and pause for a moment. If you really dig into the debate, there's really a continuum of opinion here. And it's a continuum of opinion not just among Muslims, but among those observing. Sometimes when you hear the news stories, you think there's only one authorized opinion, but that's not true. There's a diversity of opinion, and it ranges all the way from the normal and necessary. In other words, the extent to which Sharia law should be a part of the American consciousness. There's one side that argues, well, it's normal and necessary on one level. All the way to the other side is the court laws and the court debates about whether Sharia law should be banned from the United States altogether. There's a continuum of debate. On the normal and necessary side, and I'm sure quite randomly I put that over on the left, on the normal and necessary side, the debate goes like this. We do that already. I mean, we take international law into consideration now in our legal system. So, for example, in marriage cases, how do you decide whether someone's really married in America? What do you do when an international person comes in there and they say they're married? How do you decide that? Well, what happens if that country happens to be a Muslim country and they got married in a Muslim country? Don't you kind of have to look and see, well, what is their laws and what does it mean to be married in their land before you decide what it means to be married in our land? We've already had those problems before homosexual marriage was allowed here. They get married in another country where it's allowed, they come here. Is the United States going to recognize that? Well, they consider international law. How about property rights? When you sign a contract with a company that has holdings in another country and it comes back here and you're trying to decide who owns what property, who's liable for what, you consider already the international law and the laws in that country to see what's a valid contract. And so some folks say this use of Sharia law in America, it's kind of just an extension of that. If that particular country sees this as a legal matter, you kind of have to look at it just the way you would look at any other natural law. And some people would then draw analogies, again, to the Jewish law or the halakha or the Christian traditions about marriage and divorce, that's already considered sometimes in legal ways. So some people would argue this is kind of normal and necessary to do that. And if it's not, we're talking about not necessarily law as in the courts, we do have in Jewish circles, we have councils that kind of help authorize marriage and divorce. In Catholic circles, we have Catholic groups that authorize annulments and so forth. So if it's not a legal thing, it's a religious thing, what happens if there are groups in America that are doing that for Muslims? So that's one side of the debate, the normal kind of necessary part of there's no way you're going to keep Sharia law out of America. It can't happen. It's part of our legal culture. It's part of our religious custom. You're not going to keep it out. There's just too much Islam now. As I said the other day, that we're probably getting close to 9 million or so is the count I'm now hearing. Muslims in America, you're just dreaming if you think you're going to keep Sharia law out of our culture entirely. It just permeates the Muslim culture too firmly, and you have 9 million. It's not a realistic observation. Now, on the other side, you have the folks that say, no, it ought to be banned, it's dangerous, and you have all kinds of reasons for that. So let me just walk through a couple of the instances, and then it looks like we're going to be out of time. So why is it such a hot debate in America? I'll just point you to a couple cases, and then we'll call it quits here. In many ways, one of the most controversial ones early on was back in the late 90s, and it had to do with a divorce case in Maryland, where a custody case between a woman who was here in America and a man who wanted the custody, and he was from Pakistan. And the Maryland courts ruled that because the marriage laws in Pakistan were such that custody belongs to the man at a particular case after a particular age. And if there's no compelling evidence to suggest otherwise, we ought to follow the law in the land in which they were married. And so they gave custody to the man in Pakistan. And there was a very controversial subject because there were accusations of abuse and all those kind of things. But that's kind of started the war, if you will, the cultural war. And that was one of the early cases that brought a lot of attention to this problem of Sharia law. The other one that was much more sensational that really got the right wing going is this case in New Jersey where there was an accusation or a charge brought of rape in a married situation, a woman being forced to have sexual relations with her husband. And the lower court ruled that according to the definition of marriage from the culture in which they came, the husband was not going to be held liable for rape because according to his cultural definition, that was not rape, that was a right guaranteed him. And so the lower court did not refuse to press charges or refused to condemn. But then that decision was reversed by a higher court, and in fact, she was allowed to, the woman was allowed to go forward with that accusation. So that created a great deal of debate in this country, obviously for good reason. So you can see now the whole issue of what is marriage, what is not marriage, what is custody, what is not custody, the whole reality of international law, how does that help decide a case, becomes very controversial. And then more recently, there's been this movement here since 2010 or so to really just get organizations out there are helping state legislatures pass laws that say you're not allowed to use, at first it was Sharia law to decide any case. And then the Supreme Court, and that kind of all started with Oklahoma with the Save Our State Amendment. They kind of put it out there in a referendum to the voters, and 70% said, yeah, that's a good idea. There should be no Sharia law. Well, what happened is the higher courts put an injunction on that and stopped it because they argued that that was a violation of a freedom of religion statement. You couldn't target one particular religion like that called Islam and prevent its practitioner. That was contrary to federal law. And so there's been an attempt now for other state legislatures to come back and not write it as Sharia law specific, but as international law. You shouldn't use international law. And so there's similar states, and I put together, I think there's 6, 7 of those or more that have actually passed the law by now, and others, many states are still considering that measure. So it's a huge debate right now about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Some people saying, yes, let's get Sharia out of here. Other legal experts are saying, now you've made it very, very difficult you put Muslims in this situation, just like even some Christian organizations are debating that. Basically what you're saying is your moral beliefs have no justification at all, and that has nothing to do with it. And so it's part of the whole larger debate of to what extent you ought to allow your religion to decide your activity, or if your religion disagrees, are you automatically a criminal? And so there's that kind of argument going on. Two more prominent cases that I'll just mention and then we'll end. For a while there was huge buzz about Dearborn, Michigan, all kinds of, and it's still, you can go out there and see there's buzz about it. It started back where there were some Christians that were kind of witnessing for Christ in an Arab festival, and they were actually arrested for disturbing the peace. And there was a countersuit brought by these Christians groups, and then actually the federal judge in this case sided with the Christians, say you were violating their freedom of speech, and they granted damages, legal fees, and so forth to this group. So that created quite a stir in Dearborn. And then in 2013, as things would be wont to happen, somebody put out this spoof article that the city council had just adopted a regulation that Sharia law would be implemented in full in the city. And gullible as some people might be, many people believed it. And so there had to be a expose to point out that that was a joke. And so to this day, you go out there and some people still think it was true. So that was back in 2013. So Dearborn's been a place. The other place for controversy is in Dallas-Fort Worth. That's been around for, I think, at least 2013. But it kind of came to prominence where a young politician in Irving, Texas, all of a sudden got wind that there was, quote, this Sharia court in Texas. And she kind of went after this. And there's the whole idea of that, was there a Sharia court here operating in the United States, really? And through further reflection, what that is there's a mediation panel operational in Dallas-Fort Worth called the Islamic Tribunal, and it's these imams that are volunteering and saying, listen, if you're having internal Muslim, if you need some kind of official Muslim arbitration about divorce, mostly it's about divorce and custody issues, we will act as the kind of the clerical judiciary mediation council for those. And so it's a voluntary internal kind of review board, although obviously, in the heart of Texas, it's not our most liberal state in the Union. It's created quite a tension down there that there's this, quote, Sharia court, when you listen to the folks themselves and they're like, no, it's not a court. We don't have any legal standing other than to make a definitive religious statement about who's married, not married. That's what we can do for them. So it's a voluntary thing. So anyway, I just want to give you up to date so when you see these things on the internet, you'll know kind of what this is about. So obviously, you make your own choices about what you think in this matter. I just want to make sure that we're making them based upon knowledge and information, not based upon gut instinct. And I know this is shocking. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. Just saying. All right, let's end in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity to just stop and dig through all this information. It's a lot of information. It's vast swaths of history and concepts, but we just want to make good decisions. And as we participate in the public dialogue, pros and cons, what to fear, what to fight, we want to make decisions that honor your name, respect the integrity of your gospel, and are based on truth, not on fancy. And so, Father, we just ask that you would help us discern wisely how we ought to speak and act in our society. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen.